I'm Sam Barlow. I'm a game director and writer. You may know me from such games as Silent Hill Shattered Memories, Her Story, Telling Lies, and most recently Immortality. I primarily work on story games whose primary purpose is to tell a story. And to cut through a lot of the noise around what makes something a game, what is an interactive story, lots of heated discussion around these things. For me, essentially, there is no real difference between a video game story and a story told in another medium. A video game story or an interactive story is essentially a story that is told through a piece of machinery. All right, and computers are very complicated machinery. But in that sense, a book is a machine. Clearly, a television or a film projector is also a piece of machinery. And so really, for me, what distinguishes a video game story from a more conventional story is the complexity of the machinery. And really the significant difference is the level of involvement and feedback that comes out of that increase in complexity, right? A book is a machine that I have a degree of control over, but it has very little room for a kind of sophisticated interaction between me and the book that I'm reading. Now, traditionally, video games that have attempted to tell stories have run into issues. And I think one of the primary challenges when we think of a more conventional video game attempting to tell a story, and when we compare the sophistication of that story to the kind of story we might get out of a book, say, the primary challenge you have as a game designer is the player has a single brain and a single attention span, and you're asking a lot of them. So if I'm playing a first-person shooter like Halo, I'm looking at a 2D screen and attempting to pass from that a three-dimensional battlefield. As I use then analog sticks or a mouse and keyboard to move my character in this 3D space, I'm also tracking all the possible targets, thinking of who I'm going to shoot next, what weapon I'm going to use to shoot them, should I swap out my weapons, how much ammunition do I have, should I chuck a grenade, should I find some cover, whilst also holding in my head the kind of higher level objectives, what I'm attempting to do here. And so if on top of that you're also asking people to pass a story, then clearly you have this challenge, because at this point you've used up 95% of the player's brain, having them take part in this exciting battle, and you only have a little bit left, which is why a lot of traditional video games will wait until the gameplay is done and then give you a story cutscene in which you're essentially watching a mini movie, or will embed story in documents. I'm gonna walk into an empty room and now there's a diary to read, or there's a tape recording to listen to. And I think what I've been attempting to do, especially with my last few games, is find ways to create gameplay where the objective of the gameplay is itself focused on the story. So that 95% of the player's brain that is being used up doing gameplay, operating the controls, figuring out what I need to do within the kind of gameplay constraints. If we can use that 95% and have the gameplay be so integrated with the story that it's one and the same, then suddenly we get the full use of the player's imagination, and we can attempt to tell stories that are as sophisticated or as complicated in other mediums, and then actually look at the ways in which we can transform those stories through gameplay and interaction. So for me, it's quite useful to, from time to time, kind of crystallize and simplify what it is that I think makes telling a story through a video game a more interesting proposition. What ways can we use gameplay and interactivity to add to the sophistication, particularly the way in which the player's imagination is brought further and deeper into the story. And so this is like really, this is like my simple like pillars of what a story video game can be. And it's not something that I'm thinking about when I'm deep in development. This is kind of a tool for if I'm ever standing back and sort of evaluating if a game is working or thinking about a particular game idea. These are the kind of simple things that I come back to. So for me, there are 4 things that essentially a video game can do or does significantly more of than conventional mediums. And these 4 things would be, number 1 would be challenge. Now, clearly you can have, you can have a puzzle novel, you can have elements of challenge, watching a complicated mystery movie and there's kind of a puzzle to it and there's a solution or something. You can have those elements of challenge. But clearly, when one sits down to play a video game, there is an explicit invitation. And there can be all sorts of different kinds of difficulties and obstacles and things that we have to work against and learn and master in order to progress through things. So that element of challenge, which I think is an incredible hook, and it's fundamental to how human beings work, that if you put an obstacle in someone's way, there is a very primal need to then overcome that obstacle. And so having that hook of your story have this kind of challenge element, I think is a kind of fundamental to the idea of a video game. And I know there's some complexity to this. There's a debate around video games. Should I be able to fail in a video game? Should I need to exercise a certain amount of skill in order to progress? The idea of a story that just dies if the player is not bringing sufficient, gaming skill, obviously has issues. But I think in a more general sense, the idea of challenge can almost be reduced to this fact that if a player is not present, then the story does not occur, right? You can start a movie playing, you can fall asleep, the movie's still going to happen. But there's something fundamental to video games that is you have to be actively involved. And I think that does something to your brain chemistry that heightens the importance of this thing that you're interacting with. And so that there's this kind of element of challenge that I think is present in all video games. A key one for me, which I think is often overlooked, so number 2 is expression. Now, when you give the player a game mechanic and you give them a series of tools or tool inside the video game, for me, the video games that really sing and further involve the player in their imagination are those that allow for expression. The simplest example of this for me would be something like the Mario games. The design of the gameplay there is such a well thought out and thorough exploration of the idea of jumping that different players can play it in different ways. And you get to express yourself within the limitations of the idea of running and jumping. But you get to express yourself through the character of Mario, who allows you to run and jump and explore. And a super skilled Mario player will be moving 10 times faster, pulling off all sorts of clever tricks. And it's no mistake that when something like parkour blew up, and you were seeing people kind of perform these parkour sequences and stunts, they were evoking in many ways kind of examples from video games, and a lot of the elements that you would see in those video games. So that's one example. But for me, if a video game does not allow for expression, it is not as rich a video game. If everyone sits down and plays the game and has the same experience, does the same things, has the same outcomes, then you can question why is this thing interactive? Why do we need a player if it doesn't really matter who that player is? So I think when people sit down to experience a video game, if they find ways in which they get to express themselves They get to personalize things. That is very important and integral to that kind of experience. And I think that is something that very quickly makes a video game story feel more intimate and feel more unique versus more traditional examples. The third element that I think makes video games unique and is such a strong kind of through line in so many video games is the opportunity for exploration. So, human beings are a hunter-gatherer species. Again, wired into our brain is this deep natural desire to explore. We are naturally curious. We, by our very natures, at a very primal level, are compelled to explore and discover. And the kind of risk-reward of exploration and danger and discovery are just so deeply hardwired. So, it's very, very familiar across so many video games is the idea of exploration, particularly exploration in a 3D space. Whether it's an RPG, whether you're running left to right in a Mario game, so many games revolve around the joy and the pleasure of exploration. And that, I think, again, ties into the interactivity. You can give people the sense of discovery and exploration in other more linear media, but when it's actually the player's own curiosity that's genuinely making choices and genuinely kind of the engine of that exploration, you get something that's quite powerful. And then the fourth thing, which I think is clearly a unique element that you see very strongly in video games. And this fourth element is one that in my last 3 games I have essentially dismissed. And that is the element of simulation, which other people might argue is kind of a fundamental part of video gaming. Particularly the kind of modern 3D video game, right, which is full of so many simulations, whether that's the simulation of bullet physics, the simulation of all sorts of crates and rubble and stuff that bounces around, whether it's vehicle physics, whether it's the AI of enemies that you're fighting against and the simulation of how they work. It's integral. And there was certainly a movement a while back that pushed the idea that telling a story in a video game, we shouldn't be telling stories through the kind of the more traditional ways of telling a story, but we should be simulating things, creating simulations which in themselves are telling a story. And that, if you wanted to explore the idea of, it's very easy to think of things that are easily simulated for this, which is one of the restrictions, right? If you there were those kind of serious games, right? So you want to talk about what's wrong about how McDonald's works, right? Then you create a simulation of the economy and of the idea of running a fast food business, and then you let players play with the different elements of the simulation and get an understanding of the forces at work here. And I think a big part of how enjoyable video games are and how much time people can sink into a video game, I do think that comes down to how enjoyable it is to play with a simulation. And certainly it's clear that there are endorphins, happy things happen in our brain when we learn. We are really into pattern recognition. And so if you give someone a simulation to play around in, that is a very concentrated version of that. I remember when I first had, my son was born and he was getting a bit old and he was playing with blocks and stuff. And I was playing at the time Half-Life 2, which everybody was raving about because it had this incredible physics system and it had these puzzles where you had to kind of play with the physics to solve and overcome the obstacles. And I remember looking at the scene I was playing in where I was stacking up blocks to try and climb up somewhere or knock something over. And I looked down and I see my son doing it, and he's doing exactly the same thing with his blocks playing on the floor. And I kind of, it gave me a moment where I was like, all this fun that we have playing around with simulations and with game mechanics that dig into these simulations, they're intensely enjoyable and fun, but in the context of telling a story, do they help? right? Do they contribute to the story? Or, in actual fact, are they a distraction? Are the easy endorphins of playing with a simulation a prop that video games use? And, so many video games will have those densely simulated elements as exploratory, immersive elements, and then we'll have to stop to tell their bits of story. And certainly having worked on a game like Shattered Memories, which was really focused on immersion and kind of giving people a sense of place and exploration. In making it, I was aware that there was this prop that we could lean on in telling our story, which was that it was just fun to walk around and fiddle with things. So starting with her story, I made a conscious decision to avoid as much as I could simulation. So, explicit in the initial design of her story was that there was no real state tracking. There was no kind of cause and effect, which I think is an assumption a lot of people have about what an interactive narrative is, right? An interactive narrative is usually thought to be kind of a choose your own adventure, which essentially is nothing but a very simple piece of state tracking. And I think for me, the big flaw there is in attempting to give the impression of a simulation, in attempting to imply there is cause and effect to what you're doing in a choose your own adventure type game, we end up falling into these very simple descriptions of cause and effect. You made one decision in chapter 1 of the game, and then in chapter 3 there will be a single binary consequence of that decision. And I think just naturally, inherently, we realize that these are not very sophisticated simulations to the point where they're not really simulations. And I think then they fall down. And it doesn't necessarily work for story, and it doesn't necessarily work as a fun, playable simulation. So, as I say, starting with her story, I wanted to explicitly focus on creating experiences that had these very gamey elements, the challenge, the expression, and the exploration, but did not rely on the simulation. And, I think if you go by the success of her story, clearly I maybe proved my point, certainly to myself. And if you look at, take her story as an example, because it's the simplest of these 3 games that I've made recently, is there an element of challenge? Yes. There is a question you are asked to answer. There is, beyond just the question of did this woman murder her husband, there is then essentially the challenge to understand and get to know this character, to put together their story. That is not something that will happen on its own. You will have to contribute to that. You will have to infer things, figure things out, read between the lines. The kind of core game mechanic of her story asks you to pay attention, and your actions in choosing how to search and what to search for will move you closer and closer towards that goal. So there's this clear challenge, and it was definitely helpful, I think, in pitching her story to players, having them understand, why am I here, to open with that challenge, right? You're the detective. Did this woman murder her husband? And I think that is usually quite useful to give people that strong understanding that pulls them into the game. And then in terms of expression, again, this is the one that I think people don't think about as much, but to me is really, really key and important. And again, in the simple example of her story, is there expressiveness in the gameplay? Yes. In fact, the core search mechanic of her story, in which you type words, is very expressive. You can, in theory, type in any English word, and you can type in words that aren't even, shown to you in the text yet. You might have a leap of logic and be like, oh, I think so-and-so did this thing. I think this is important. And you can start searching for things, almost, kind of getting ahead of the narrative. In watching a clip and listening to the woman being interviewed talk and then picking up on things that she said, again, that suddenly becomes an expressive act, because you're saying, this is what I think is important in this scene. And the game is not highlighting those. It's not reducing your choices. It's saying you can pick up on anything in this scene. So when you sit and watch a scene and you're like, oh, I think this mention of this little element is important. She talked about the profession of her husband. That seems interesting to me. And then, you're playing with your partner, and your partner's like, no. Every time she talks about this location, clearly there's something significant going on. We should dig into that. So, through the simple, very open, and it's a very simple, shallow, essentially, game mechanic, but it's very wide. You have a whole range of things you can do. That ultimately becomes quite expressive. And, again, to make that comparison with Mario, there's very little you can do in a Mario game. You can run and jump, but the beauty of Nintendo is that running and jumping has a great degree of finesse and expressivity to it. So, you can see that is quite carefully baked into her story. And that kind of question I asked earlier of, if two different players sit down to play a game, will they have exactly the same experience, right? Potentially, if you sit down to play a linear first-person shooter, corridor shooter, you might end up having a very similar game. If you sit down to play, a cinematic platformer like Uncharted, there's a good chance that two players will have a pretty similar experience. Maybe punctuated by how quickly they completed sequences or how many times they failed, but essentially what they do will be the same. So the expressivity is quite limited. Whereas any two people that play Her Story bring their own subjectivity in. The things they choose to pick up on, the order in which they unlock things, the degree to which they fill in the blanks, the version of the story they assemble in their head is very personal and unique. So this is a game that is quite expressive, despite the fact that it has no simulation, despite the fact that it has no kind of freeform gameplay, it's still expressive. Then when you get to exploration, in many ways, Her Story is kind of a Metroidvania. As you discover pieces of the story, you're slowly building up a mental map of the story in the same way that you would build up a mental map of a planet in Metroid. If you discover names of key characters, events that happened, those essentially, become your keys or your powers that allow you to navigate in different ways. You have the ability and then kind of the requirement to rewatch clips in the same way that you might retraverse in a Metroid game and have a different understanding and then be able to gain access to different areas. You have that. So there is this very strong exploratory element. What we were essentially doing with Her Story was taking all of that three-dimensional exploration, the spatial exploration, and transposing it on the idea of a story. So, the player's curiosity is driving them. There is not a fixed route for them to take. They can choose directions to head in. They can choose how thoroughly to explore, whether they want to go to the big, go straight to the big topics, big juicy things, or kind of go off-piste, noodle around in little bits of story and side story. So it's very comparable to a more deeply explorable 3D game. And again, this is like a very key video gamey thing. So you can see how in something like Her Story, I kept myself honest. It was as much as from, a distance you could look at Her Story and think of this as being a narrative-driven video game and not having a lot of traditional gameplay. Ultimately, I think Her Story succeeds because as a narrative video game, it is wholeheartedly a video game. It's challenging, it's expressive, and it's exploratory. And then I think you can also see that the removal of the simulation aspect is not necessarily a big problem for this game. So that's my way of thinking of narrative video games as being intrinsically video gamey and understanding those core drives and elements which allow us to elevate things, using the interactivity in a way that is very rich and wholesome. So the other way, give it with those as a given for how these games are working, then to get more precise and think specifically about an individual game and how I'm executing this game. The other check that I do, and again, this is not necessarily something that is on my mind when I'm in the midst, but this is definitely the way that I kind of check that every element and the execution is actually working. So I have a thing that I call, I think I messed this up in the name of the talk actually, because I have three things. I have a thing that is an emotion, an idea, and a metaphor. And again, I think with a video game, even if it's like a huge, super expensive video game with all sorts going on, I think still when you are pitching it to a player and when a player is sitting down to enjoy it, there needs to be a level of simplicity and focus in terms of what am I expecting to do here? What is this about? What is going to happen when I play this game? So I have this thing that I call the emotion, the idea, and the metaphor. And so every game I make has an emotion that can be very specific that I am trying to create in the player. This is what I want them to feel. And there is also an idea. So the idea is, more thematic, more intellectual, but this is the idea I want to get across. And this is also a way a lot of people, when you try and define what is a story, what is the point of a story, and I think the unique ability of a story is to allow you to feel and think at the same time. That's what a story does. In real life, we see someone run over in front of us, and there's an immediate emotional reaction to that. And then a week later, we might reflect on this now that the emotion has subsided somewhat and think about our own mortality, right? And think about what that meant. The beauty of a story is that we can do these things simultaneously because of the fact that we're choosing to interact with something that is not absolutely real, but feels that way, allows us to have these things simultaneously. So there'll be an emotion and an idea, and then the means to the end is the metaphor. What is, and I call it the metaphor. Sometimes you could think of it as like the game mechanic, but it's like what is the metaphor that is going to be the vehicle to get us to this place. So by way of example, my game Telling Lies, the emotion was, what does it feel like to realize that the person you loved is not who you thought they were? How does that feel like? That combination of betrayal, of reality opening up, the sadness, the disappointment, the shock, what that specific emotion, like how does that feel? The idea is we never truly know those that we're intimate with, right? Which is quite a primal idea, and you can kind of dig into that idea a bit more and ask, how well do we truly know other people? To what extent are we projecting ourselves onto them? How much is our impression of people colored by our own experiences, by our subjectivity? All very interesting ideas, but that was the idea. And then the metaphor was surveillance, was thinking about people who surveil, in this case, government and FBI surveillance. The act of surveilling somebody, to sit, and it's very long and boring, right? To surveil somebody is to sit and watch the minutiae of their domestic lives, looking for the one little thing that you need. And essentially, the person who's doing the surveilling is obsessively watching someone. And so they can come to know someone in a great deal of detail. But the virtue of the surveillance is you have a very kind of blinkered view onto them, right? In the olden days, you're sat in a car looking through binoculars through a window, so you're only seeing glimpses. You might be listening in on a kind of bug or a listening device, and so there is a limitation there to what you're seeing or hearing. And then with the heightened surveillance that we have in something like Telling Lies, where you're actually spying through someone's webcam, again, you're only seeing that individual at the moments when they sit down in front of the webcam or pass in front of the webcam. So there is a limited frame to it, but there's an obsessiveness, and there is a familiarity that someone doing the surveillance has with their victim or subject. And so that became a very useful and powerful metaphor for exploring this emotion and these questions. Here's a game that was going to let you get to know a number of individuals and understand, as you jump around the timeline, realize that there are lies being told, understand the betrayal, but also have this desire as the player of the game, as the person doing the surveillance, this desire to get inside other people's heads, to understand what they're thinking. And so this is a tool that I use, and it's a tool that I use when starting a game. So before getting into the weeds, like, is this a good idea for a game? Can I, is this going to work? If I put lots of work, put in lots of time and effort, in 2 years' time, if I execute on this thing, will it be a game I can sell to people? Will it be a game that people will understand, that will be effective? Is it a game worth making? And it's very easy to answer that question, because I can say, well, this is an emotion that I think is interesting, and is relevant to other human beings. This is an idea that I think is in itself worth exploring, raises lots of interesting questions. And the metaphor, which, like I say, often translates somewhat to the game mechanic, is understandable, because that's the thing you're mostly going to be explaining to people, is that game mechanical metaphor is going to be the thing that you explain to people. And I say, well, what do I do in this game? What is this game about? And obviously 99% of video games, that metaphor is shooting people, and that's quite limited. So knowing that you have this interesting set of three things, for me, that is the starting point. That is going, well, okay, I can now proceed to actually think these things through and put some more flesh on the bones. And then at every step of the process, these are now a useful tool as well to look at any given element of the game, a scene in the game, an implementation of the game mechanic, a particular use of controls, something that you're tweaking or balancing. You look at it and you go, is this getting me closer to feeling that emotion? Is this going to take us somewhere where we'll feel that emotion? Does this allow us to explore that idea? Does this interrogate that idea? Does this give information or data that's going to feed into the discussion of that idea? And then the metaphor, again, when we're making Telling Lies, there were some interesting design choices we made, but they all related back to the surveillance. Like, what ability should the player have? How quickly should we be able to move through this footage? What is the format and the pacing of the scenes that we are shooting? How are we actually writing this dialogue? All of that was through the lens of surveillance. The pacing, the types of scenes we'd be seeing, the non-cinematic nature of how we are filming and how things are scripted. The design of the computer interface was to put us in the position of someone who is surveilling. In that game, you are constantly reminded, there's a reflection in the screen, reminding you that you are playing the role of someone that is watching. And in a way, you're almost being watched yourself by that reflection, but that's the character you're playing. So everything in the game is fed through the lens of these three elements. And so that's just a useful thing as you're going to just refer back to these. And knowing that this is a solid foundation for the game, if you're constantly referring back to them and ticking them off, then you kind of know you're on track to actually delivering on that original vision in a way that is focused and succinct. So those are how I go about approaching my video games. Like I say, a narrative video game is a story told through a machine. In this case, a piece of machinery is a complicated video game. And in being a video game, we worry about, does this experience offer some challenge, some expression, very key, and exploration. I will leave it up to you as to whether simulation is an important part of the package. And then once we start to develop a specific idea for that video game, we can really encapsulate that idea in these three ideas. What is the emotion I'm trying to communicate? What is the idea we're exploring? And then what is the metaphor that is the vehicle for this exploration? Okay, I should be around for some questions if anyone has anything to ask.